Today, we're gonna iron out the kinks in your conventional deadlift. This is meant to be a technique progression for injury prevention and for also hitting max numbers. It doesn't matter who you are, you cannot out corrective exercise bad exercise. So, where most people fall flat in the deadlift, mostly it comes down to setup and execution, of course, but most people run up to this bar almost mindlessly. So what I always get my athletes into, what I always get my, especially lower back cases that are centered around deadlifting injuries, is get them first acquainted to what are your feet doing. So what I usually get my athletes into is a little bit of what's called foundational training. And what I have them do is set up in approximately their stance width in the deadlift, and then soften up at the hips, soften up in the knees, and more or less an athletic position. I don't want you trying to find your balance while your legs are locked. And then what I want them to do is rock all the way into the heels, all the way into the toes, go back and forth until you find the midpoint, where it's neither all in the front or in the back, it's balanced. And then what I get people into doing is take their fingertips together like this and use their pecs to squeeze them together and hinge down to the bar. But while they do, fingertips and tailbone travel apart from each other in this sort of fashion. Now, most people either lose their balance at the start of the deadlift or throughout the exercise itself. They may not realize it, but what they're doing is they're losing leverage. And when you lose leverage, you lose the movement. If you lose the movement, injury risk is very high. So I always get them into the position of just getting balanced at the feet first, fingertips together, tailbone and hands travel apart from each other. Now in the position where they could normally drop their arms down to grab the barbell, I should be able to go up to you and shove you in any direction and you don't move. You stay locked in. You want to feel like you could hang out in this position all day long. If it feels awkward or uncomfortable, find the right position. It's going to be different for different limb lengths, different leverages, different joint angles, but find what's comfortable. But more importantly, find what's balanced. Rock through the feet, fingertips together, squeeze them. Tailbones and hand travel apart from each other. At this point, you should be able to drop down and grab the bar. However, that's moving too fast. So what I have my athletes do is walk straight up to the bar, find whatever stance width you prefer, whether it's very narrow with heels in or closer to shoulder width apart. The general rule of thumb is if you were to jump up onto a plyo box, right as you're loading, before you would jump, that's probably your ideal deadlift position or somewhere near there. And with this progression, I have people walk right up to the bar, usually with that bar hovering right over the front of the ankle joint. So not in front of the toes, shins not jammed all the way up against the bar, but in a position where if you were to bend down and grab the bar, your shins run right up to it. But before we get started, before we even rock through the feet, what I have my people do is get a little bit of lat engagement to begin with. Now this is something that I see a lot of coaches, a lot of athletes cue, is more lat engagement during a deadlift. What does that mean? It doesn't mean imaginary lat syndrome. What it means is an anti-shrug. And this is straight out of Dr. Stu McGill. So what I always have my people do, if I want to get serious lat engagement, what is a shrug? What's the opposite? But really what I have them do is I say, stand as tall as you can, and without bending over, I want you to tap your thighs. And then tap a little lower. Tap a little lower still. You should feel your pecs and lats get very, very rigid, but more importantly, your arms are as long as possible. And I tell them to lock this anti-shrug position in first. Now at that point, you can do whatever you want with your hands, but when most people see somebody set up for a deadlift and they swing their arms up, that's really kind of like the poor man's lat engagement. It's like you may lose that after you set up on the start position. So going through this step by step. Foot placement first. Tap your thighs. Tap a little lower still. Lock in the anti-shrug. Then find the balance through your feet. Find the midpoint. Soften up at the hips and knees. And you want to be thinking just like we were here, where the hips sit back as the torso leans forward. You don't want to think fold forward like this, nor do you want to squat down to the bar It's coupled motion at the hips and the knee. Reaching in both directions, that's where you would drop. But first, lat engagement, lock this in place, try to mimic the same motion. Coupled motion at both. And now if you reach the limits of your hamstring tolerance here, say maybe you're pulling from a deficit, or maybe you just have very tight hamstrings to begin with, what you might find is, oh, that's as far as my hamstrings will let me go. At that point, that's when you start to allow a little bit of knee motion, a little bit of sink at the knees to be able to reach the bar. And now I'm not referring to knees moving forward in this direction. I'm referring to knees moving apart, just enough to be able to reach the bar. You want to generate a tremendous amount of tension at the start of this movement. You don't want to be loose and sloppy to begin with. That's where a lot of injuries take place. Feet set. Anti-shrugs locked in. Balance out through the feet. Load up those hamstrings. And when you can't load them up anymore, knees apart, just enough to reach the bar. Now what you may notice in this film is that my shoulders should be in front of the end of this bar cap. That is not the position you want to start in. You may hear a lot of coaches talk about taking slack out of the bar. Really what they're referring to is going from here to here for a good starting position. And what you may notice is that my hips drop just a little bit. You want just enough loading where you can lean back against this. Think of this like a teeter-totter. If this bar weighed 400 pounds and I weighed 200, I can either dead pull 400 pounds off the ground, do 400 pounds of work, or I could leverage or teeter-totter my 200 pounds against it in this sort of fashion to subtract my weight from the load that I'm moving, doing 200 pounds worth of work. This is the true meaning of taking slack out of the bar. Keep your arms long while you do this. Don't lose the anti-shrug. Balance through the feet, anti-shrug, coupled motion at the hips, load the hamstrings as tight as you possibly can, knees travel apart, just enough to be able to latch onto the bar, sit back. At that point, you're ready to go. So now that we've ironed out the wrinkles in your setup, now it's time to execute. So what you want to think when you're pulling from the ground is you want to be in the tightest possible position. You want everything along your posterior chain to be as ready to go as humanly possible. You don't want any slack. You don't want hips to drop down. You don't want to be starting with your hips all the way up in the air and your shoulders in front of the bar. Shoulders are stacked. Now you're ready to go. Now there's a lot that can go wrong during a deadlift, but if you stick to a few fundamental key technique differences, most of the time you're going to be in a good position here. What you want to think though is that anytime that bar gets further away from your center of mass that's moving it, the higher the injury risk likelihood. But also too, the less force you can generate, the less weight you can move. So what you want to think is as you pull this off of the ground, as that bar leaves the ground, it is in constant contact with your legs and you end standing tall. You don't end standing with your hips forward, extending all the way back like this. So again, going through quick setup, stance width, stand tall, tap the thighs, tap a little lower, lock this in place, coupled motion at the hip, load the hamstrings as tightly as humanly possible, just enough of a knee sink in either direction to be able to latch onto the bar. Pull your weight back against it, get the shoulders centered over the end of the bar cap, and scrape along the thighs the entire way in standing tall. Just like this. And now that bar stays in constant contact with your legs both on the way up as well as on the way down. Now, if you're ironing out any kinks in your deadlifting technique, I always recommend let go of the bar between each repetition. So say if you have programmed 4 sets of 5, if you just practice the setup and technique on the first rep, you will only get 4 tries at setup and technique. However, if you physically let go of the bar, stand up in between each repetition, go through the setup again, you are now getting 20 tries at the setup and technique instead of 4. So you will meet that learning curve much, much quicker. Stance width. Get balanced through the feet. Stand tall. Lock in that anti-shrug. Hinge down. Load the hamstrings as tightly as humanly possible. Just enough of a knee sink, knees moving apart to latch on. Leverage your weight against it. Teeter-totter. Scrape the thighs. Drive your hips in. If you don't feel comfortable with this setup pulling from the floor, I always recommend starting in a rack with that bar just about at your knees, maybe slightly lower. Slowly move these pins down further and further until you feel comfortable with the form enough to start pulling from the floor.